Long before roads were named and homes were marked, people believed that a name was not just a sound. A name was a weight, a promise, a bond between the living and the unseen. In the oldest stories, passed from elders to children by firelight, there was a spirit who did not walk the earth but moved through it. The spirit had no face and no voice that stayed the same. It was not evil nor was it kind. It was a keeper, a guardian of balance. It watched over names the way the night watches over sleep, quietly, patiently, always present. The elders said the spirit understood one truth above all others. A person could lose their home, their wealth, even their body, and still remain themselves. But if a person lost their name, they lost the shape of who they were. Without a name, memory thinned. Purpose faded. An identity unraveled like old cloth. That was why the rule existed. Never mock, a warning spoken in the spirit's shadow. The rule was not written in books. It did not hang on walls. It lived in cautionary tales and half-finished sentences. It was whispered when storms came too fast, or when a child laughed at a grave. Names were sacred. And to laugh at a warning meant more than disrespect. It meant fracture. A crack in the self that could not always be sealed again. Most people listened. Some pretended to listen. And a few believed they were smarter than the stories. The elders remembered those few. They remembered a merchant who scoffed at a sign carved into stone, who later wandered the market unable to answer when called. They remembered a singer whose name vanished from every song she ever wrote. In each story, disbelief came first. Laughter followed. And silence came last. But time passed. Cities grew louder. The old stories softened at the edges. People began to call them metaphors instead of truths. The spirit did not disappear. It waited. It always waited. That was the nature of balance. It did not rush. It did not warn twice in the same way. And it never took without offering a choice first. A warning, when it came, was not meant to frighten. It was meant to protect. To give space for humility. To turn a person back before the ground gave way beneath them. But warnings are fragile things. They rely on being believed. And belief had grown thin. The elders sensed it long before it happened. They felt it in the way names were spoken carelessly, tossed around like jokes. They felt it when people mocked traditions without learning why they existed. When laughter came too easily in sacred places. They said the spirit had grown tired. Not angry. Not cruel. Tired. The last forgiveness, they whispered, would not come after mockery. It would come before it or not at all. Somewhere, in a city that no longer remembered its own beginnings, a man was about to hear a warning meant only for him. A warning spoken softly, without threat or force. A warning that asked nothing except respect. And when he laughed, something unseen leaned closer. The balance shifted. The spirit listened. And the cost of disbelief began to take shape. In the heart of the city lived a man who believed the world bent to confidence and reason alone. He was known everywhere he went. His face appeared on screens, his voice echoed in halls, and his opinions carried weight long after he left a room. People said he had a gift for words, sharp, fast, and polished like glass. He could turn any conversation into a performance, any argument into applause. And at the center of it all was his name. His name opened doors. It drew smiles from strangers and respect from rivals. It was printed on invitations, stamped on documents, and spoken with certainty by people who wanted something from him. To him, that name was proof that he mattered. Proof that he had earned his place. He trusted nothing he could not measure. Spirits, traditions, warnings passed down through stories, these were, in his mind, tools used to keep people obedient. He believed fear was invented by those who lacked power, and myths were excuses made by those who failed. When elders spoke of balance or unseen forces, he smiled politely, then dismissed their words as outdated thinking. Names, he once said during a public talk, are just labels. Sounds we agree to answer to. They don't hold power, people do. The crowd laughed. He enjoyed that laughter. To him, identity was built through effort, visibility, and control. He believed that if you worked hard enough, spoke loudly enough, and claimed enough space, nothing could take who you were from you. He wore his certainty like armor. But beneath that confidence lived cracks few people noticed. He rarely visited his family anymore. Calls went unanswered. Invitations were postponed until later that never came. When elders tried to advise him, he waved them off with patience that felt thin and practiced. He respected them, he claimed, but only as symbols of the past, not as voices worth listening to. At gatherings, people sometimes fell quiet when he spoke. Not because they disagreed, but because something in his certainty left no room for doubt. No space for caution. He filled every silence quickly, uncomfortable with moments where he was not in control. Those closest to him felt it most. They sensed the distance behind his charm. He leaned away from anything that challenged his view of the world. He laughed easily, but he did not listen deeply. He spoke often of legacy, yet rarely asked what kind of legacy remained when the noise faded. Still, no one questioned him openly. His name was too strong. It carried history now, awards, achievements, recognition. It was tied to success stories and headlines. To challenge him felt like challenging a fact already written. And that was why the warning, when it came, mattered. Because it reached a man who believed nothing unseen could touch him. He walked through life as if protected by logic and reputation. He believed consequences belonged only to those who made foolish choices, not to someone as careful and calculated as himself. Every step he took felt earned. Every success felt deserved. He had forgotten, or never learned, that some things are not taken by force. Some things are taken because they were never respected. In quiet moments, when applause faded and rooms emptied, a faint unease sometimes crept in. A sense that something old was watching. He brushed it aside. Stress, he told himself. Fatigue. The price of ambition. He did not believe in warnings. He believed in outcomes. And outcomes, he was sure, always favored those who stood tall and spoke first. So when whispers of ancient rules surfaced in conversation, he turned them into jokes. When traditions were mentioned, he reframed them as lessons in psychology, not truth. He believed he was freeing people from fear. He did not realize he was stepping closer to something that did not argue back. Something that did not need belief to exist. By the time the air around him began to feel heavier, by the time glances lingered just a moment too long, it was already too late to pretend the stories were harmless. The man who believed names were powerless had built his entire self around one. And soon that belief would be tested. Not with anger, not with force, but with silence. It happened on a day that should have meant nothing. The sky was clear, the streets loud with movement and routine. People hurried past each other with phones pressed to their ears and eyes fixed forward. The man moved through them easily, familiar with the way crowds bent around confidence. He was on his way to an event, already thinking about the words he would say and the response they would earn. That was when the air changed. It was subtle at first. A thinning of sound. The steady noise of the city dulled, as if someone had placed a hand over it. He slowed without knowing why. The light seemed flatter, colors less certain. Even his footsteps felt heavier against the ground. Ahead of him, near a narrow crossing where old buildings leaned close together, someone stood waiting. The figure did not block his path. Did not call out. Simply stood there, wrapped in plain clothing that seemed older than the street itself. The face was unremarkable, yet hard to look at directly. Not because it was frightening, but because it refused to settle in his vision, as if memory slid off at the moment he tried to focus. He almost walked past. Almost. Something in the stillness stopped him. The figure lifted its head, and though the voice that followed was calm, it carried weight. Not volume. Weight. It spoke of balance. It spoke of names. It spoke carefully, as if each word mattered more than the last. The message was not dramatic, not threatening. There was no promise of pain, no demand for obedience. Only a warning shaped like advice. Continue as you are, and what you carry will be taken from you. Not your work. Not your wealth. Your name. The street felt colder. For a moment, just a moment, the man felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest. A flicker of doubt. The kind that comes before laughter, when fear has not yet decided what shape to take. Then he smiled. He let out a short laugh, sharp and dismissive. He glanced around, making sure others could hear. Turning the moment into a performance came easily to him. He thanked the figure for the concern, spoke lightly about stress and superstition, and made a joke about how people still believed in stories meant for children. A few passers-by slowed. Some smiled uncertainly. Others looked away. The man continued, his voice confident, playful, loud enough to drown out the quiet tension gathering in the air. He turned the warning into a clever story, a lesson about fear and imagination. He made it sound harmless, entertaining. The figure did not react. It did not argue. It did not defend itself. It simply watched. As the man finished speaking and stepped away, the world seemed to inhale. The sound of traffic returned too quickly. Colors sharpened again. The moment folded in on itself as if it had never happened. When he looked back, the figure was gone. The crossing stood empty, ordinary, forgettable. He shook his head and moved on, already replaying the moment with humor, reshaping it into something amusing he could share later. He felt pleased with himself, for staying calm, for refusing to be shaken, for proving how little power such warnings held. But something followed him. Not footsteps. Not a voice. Pause. At the event, introductions flowed smoothly, almost. A host hesitated before saying his name, stumbling briefly as if searching for the right word. The man corrected them with a laugh, brushing it off. These things happen all the time. Later, when his name appeared on a screen, the font looked slightly wrong. He blinked, assuming it was his eyes. When applause rose, it felt a second late. Nothing clear enough to worry about. Nothing obvious enough to fear. Yet beneath the surface something had shifted. Like a crack forming deep inside stone, unseen but spreading. The balance had been touched, and balance does not forget. That night, as he prepared to sleep, the echo of his own laughter returned to him. It sounded thinner than before. Less certain. He told himself it meant nothing. Warnings only mattered if you believed in them. And he did not. Somewhere beyond sight, the unseen spirit listened, not with anger but with attention. The warning had been given. The choice had been made. And the first thread of his name had begun to loosen. At first, nothing truly broke. Life continued with its familiar rhythm. Meetings filled his days. Messages stacked in his inbox. Faces still turned toward him when he entered a room. If anything felt different, it was small enough to ignore. Small enough to blame on distraction. But the pauses began to multiply. At a gathering a few days later, someone he had known for years greeted him with a smile that lingered too long. Their mouth opened, then closed. A flicker of confusion crossed their face. "Good to see you," they said instead. "No name." He laughed it off, filling the space himself, slipping into conversation as if nothing had happened. People forgot names all the time. It meant nothing. Except it kept happening. Introductions grew awkward. Hosts avoided saying his name directly, choosing titles or vague gestures instead. Emails arrived without salutations. Messages began with phrases like "hello there" or "hope you're well," where his name once stood confidently at the top. When he noticed, irritation followed quickly. He corrected people with forced smiles, reminding them who he was. Most apologized, embarrassed, claiming their minds had gone blank. A few laughed nervously, as if the mistake unsettled them more than it should have. He told himself it was coincidence. Stress did strange things to people. His schedule had been heavy. The city was busy. Names slipped. Yet the feeling lingered, that wrongness he could not fully explain. Documents began to look unfamiliar. On a form he reviewed twice, his name appeared slightly blurred, as though the ink had been smudged before drying. When he checked again, it looked normal. He blamed tired eyes. When he typed his name into a system, the autocorrect hesitated, offering strange alternatives before settling. He shook his head and pushed on. But inside something tightened. The laughter he once used so easily began to feel hollow. Each joke landed, but the sound echoed strangely, like it had been spoken into an empty space. Applause still came, but it no longer filled him the way it used to. He noticed how quickly rooms returned to noise once he stopped speaking. In quiet moments, a sense of being slightly out of place followed him, like standing half a step behind himself. At night, sleep came unevenly. Dreams slipped away before he could remember them, leaving only impressions: dark water, fading voices, a name spoken just out of reach. He woke with a faint panic he could not name, his heart racing for reasons he refused to examine. The elders' stories returned to him uninvited. He dismissed them with annoyance. He had not changed. The world had. People were careless. Systems were flawed. He was reading too much into ordinary mistakes. Still, the unease grew. During one public appearance, the moderator paused longer than usual before addressing him. The hesitation stretched, visible and uncomfortable. When they finally spoke, they avoided his name entirely, leaning into his reputation instead. The audience didn't notice. He did. For the first time, anger surfaced, not loud but sharp. A quiet edge to his thoughts. He felt the need to reassert himself, to remind people of who he was. He spoke more forcefully, took up more space, laughed louder. But the more he pushed, the more distant something became. He began to sense it then, not as a presence but as pressure. Like standing under a low ceiling he could not see. The air felt heavier in certain places. Old streets, quiet rooms. Anywhere laughter felt out of place. Once, passing the narrow crossing where he had met the strange figure, he slowed without meaning to. Nothing stood there now. Just stone and shadow. Yet the same thinning of sound brushed past him, fleeting but unmistakable. He walked faster. He did not want to believe in patterns. But patterns were forming. Names written on paper seemed less certain. Spoken aloud, they lost weight. When he said his own name in the mirror, It sounded slightly wrong, like a word from another language he no longer spoke fluently. That was when fear first showed its face. Not fully. Not honestly. Just enough to make him stop laughing alone. Just enough to make silence feel dangerous. Somewhere beyond sight, the unseen spirit remained still. It did not rush the unraveling. Balance never did. It allowed space for denial. For pride. For second chances disguised as accidents. But laughter once mocked does not return the same way. It fades. And when it echoes, it carries a warning of its own. The day his name vanished did not begin with thunder or darkness. It began like any other morning. Sunlight pressed through the curtains. The city hummed beyond the walls. He moved through his routine with practiced ease, dressing carefully, checking his reflection, straightening details that reminded him of control. He told himself the strange days behind him were nothing more than a stretch of bad focus. A story his mind had exaggerated. By mid-morning that belief was gone. It started with a simple interaction. He entered a building where he was known, where his presence usually brought instant recognition. The receptionist looked up, smiled politely, and waited. He waited too. Seconds passed. Her smile faltered. "How can I help you?" she asked, voice unsure. He gave his name. She blinked. "I'm sorry," she said after a pause. "Could you repeat that?" He did. Slower this time. Clear. Her brow furrowed. She typed something, frowned at the screen, then looked back at him with quiet confusion. "I don't see that here." Annoyance flared. He leaned closer, pointed to the appointment schedule. His slot was there. The time. The room. Everything was correct, except the name field, which sat empty as if no one had ever filled it in. "That's mine," he said firmly. She hesitated. "There's no name attached." He laughed once, sharp and forced. "That's not possible." But the words felt thin the moment he said them. Inside the meeting room, the confusion deepened. People he had worked with for years greeted him cautiously. Familiar smiles wavered. Conversations slowed when he entered. When he spoke, heads turned, but not with recognition. With curiosity. At one point, someone tried to introduce him to the room. They opened their mouth. Nothing came out. The silence stretched until someone else filled it, changing the subject quickly. No one laughed. No one met his eyes. His chest tightened. He excused himself and went to the restroom, gripping the sink as he stared into the mirror. He said his name aloud. It echoed back wrong. Not mispronounced. Not forgotten. Wrong, like a sound without meaning. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through contacts. His number was still there, but the name field showed a blank space. Messages sent to him listed no sender. Old conversations labeled with his name now carried only time stamps. He checked official records. Accounts. Profiles. Everywhere his name should have been, there was absence. Not erased violently. Not scratched out. Simply a missing. Panic rose fast and sharp. He tried to log into a system that had always known him. An error appeared, polite and final. User not found. He drove home in a daze, gripping the wheel too tightly. The streets looked the same, but something had shifted. Billboards blurred. Street signs felt unfamiliar. He passed places tied to memories that now felt distant, like they belonged to someone else. At home, he tore through drawers and boxes. Certificates. Letters. Awards. His name had once filled these pages proudly. Now they looked unfinished. Lines sat empty where his name should have been, as if the documents had been waiting for something that never arrived. Photographs still showed him, but captions were gone. Frames felt heavier in his hands, like objects that no longer recognized their owner. He sat on the floor, surrounded by proof of a life that could no longer say who it belonged to. Fear settled fully then. Not fear of embarrassment. Not fear of loss of status. Fear of disappearance. He tried to call family. The phone rang. A familiar voice answered, and hesitated the moment he spoke. "Who is this?" they asked carefully. He explained. Rush. Pleaded. Used shared memories as anchors. The voice on the other end grew quieter, uncertain. "I'm sorry," they said gently. "I know those stories. I don't know who you are." The line went dead. Something inside him cracked open. He realized then what the warning had meant. This was not metaphor. Not stress. Not coincidence. This was a taking. His name had not been hidden. It had been removed. Without it, the world could no longer hold him properly. People saw him, heard him, spoke with him, but could not place him. He had become unanchored, slipping between moments without leaving a mark. As evening fell, the weight of it pressed down hard. He felt smaller, quieter. Even his thoughts seemed less sharp, as if words themselves were becoming harder to grasp. He remembered the figure at the crossing, the calm voice, the careful warning, the laughter that followed. Regret burned, heavy and useless. He had believed names were powerless. Now he understood they were vessels, and his had been emptied. As night settled, the house felt unfamiliar. He walked through rooms that no longer seemed to belong to him. The silence was thick, watchful. Somewhere within it, he sensed a presence, not close, not distant, simply aware. The spirit did not appear. It did not need to. The balance had shifted fully now. And the man who once believed nothing unseen could touch him sat alone, nameless, finally understanding the cost of disbelief. The days that followed blurred together, not because they were busy, but because they were empty in a way he had never known before. Without a name, the world no longer held him in place. At first, he tried to live as he always had. He went out early, dressed carefully, and stepped into familiar spaces with practiced confidence. But each time, the same quiet resistance met him. Doors did not open easily. Conversations stalled. Eyes slid past him as if he were standing slightly out of focus. People noticed him, but they could not remember him. At cafes, orders were called without names. He waited longer than others, unsure when to step forward. At offices, receptionists asked him to sign in, then frowned at the empty line where his name should be. Some handed the clipboard back gently, suggesting he come back later. Later never helped. Authority, once natural to him, vanished completely. His words still carried sound, but no weight. Suggestions were ignored. Requests were delayed. Decisions were made around him, not with him. It was as if the world had agreed, silently, that he did not quite count. He felt himself shrinking. Not physically but inwardly. His posture softened. His voice lowered. The sharp edges of his confidence dulled with each failed interaction. He began to speak less, choosing silence over the embarrassment of watching people struggle to place him. The loneliness came next. Friends he reached out to listen politely, then forgot. Plans were made and broken without explanation. Messages went unanswered, not out of cruelty, but because once the screen went dark, so did the memory of him. He existed only in the moment he stood before someone. The instant he left, he slipped away. Even family ties could not hold. When he visited his childhood home, the door opened with caution. Familiar faces looked at him with kindness mixed with distance. They offered him a seat, a glass of water, but no warmth of recognition, no shared history. The walls still held memories, but he could not reach them through the people who once shared them. He left early, carrying a silence heavier than anger. At night, the erosion deepened. He noticed gaps forming in his own thoughts. Memories once clear now felt thin, like pages worn too smooth to read. He remembered achievements but not the feelings attached to them. Faces blurred at the edges. Events lost sequence. Without a name, his mind struggled to anchor itself. He began to question who he had been. The confidence, the certainty, the laughter. Were those truly his, or were they shaped by the way others had spoken his name? Without that reflection, without that steady return of identity from the world, he felt hollow. Shame crept in quietly. He thought of every time he had dismissed someone else's fear. Every joke he had made at the expense of tradition. Every warning he had waved away with charm and cleverness. He had believed himself untouchable. Now he could barely be touched at all. He stopped attending public events. Stopped trying to reclaim old routines. Instead, he walked the city alone, drawn to quieter places. Old streets, forgotten corners, spaces where history lingered. In those places the air felt heavier but honest. Sometimes he sensed the spirit. Not as a figure. Not as a voice. As pressure. As awareness. Like standing beneath something vast that did not need to move to be felt. The spirit did not torment him. It did not hurry him. It allowed the consequences to do their work. As weeks passed, his sense of purpose thinned further. Without recognition, ambition felt pointless. Without a future shaped by his name, goals lost direction. He woke each day unsure of what he was meant to do, or why he should do anything at all. This frightened him more than isolation. Because without purpose he was not just invisible. He was dissolving. One evening, sitting alone on a bench near the edge of the city, he watched people pass. Couples laughed. Children called to parents. Names flew through the air freely, anchoring people to one another. He felt an ache he could not describe. A longing not to be famous, not to be admired, but simply to belong. For the first time, humility took root. Not the kind spoken aloud. The quiet kind that grows from loss. He admitted, if only to himself, that he had been wrong. That names were not powerless. They were responsibilities, mirrors, threads that tied a person to others and to themselves. Without he was unraveling. That night something changed. He did not hear a voice. He did not see a sign. But an understanding settled over him, slow and heavy. This loss was not meant to destroy him. It was meant to strip him. To leave only what was real beneath the performance. And in that emptiness a question formed, one he had never asked before. If my name never returns, who will I choose to be? The silence that followed did not answer him. But it opened a path. One that led back toward the truths he had once mocked. And the possibility, however faint, that understanding them might be the first step toward being remembered again. The decision to seek answers did not come with confidence. It came with exhaustion. After weeks of drifting through days that barely held him, he realized that waiting would change nothing. The Spirit had not come to him again. The world would not correct itself. If understanding existed, he would have to walk toward it without the shield of certainty he once wore so easily. So he returned to places he had long avoided. Old neighborhoods where time moved slower. Community halls that smelled of dust and memory. Homes where elders still spoke carefully, as if words mattered more than speed. These were the places he had once dismissed as relics of fear. Now they were all he had. At first, doors opened cautiously. Without a name, introductions felt awkward. He explained himself simply, without performance or humor. Some listened. Others turned him away politely, unable to hold his presence for long. But a few sensed something deeper in him, something broken but honest. Those few allowed him to stay. They spoke to him of names not as labels but as vessels. A name, they said, carries the weight of how a person moves through the world. It holds memory, accountability, and connection. When spoken, it binds past actions to present moments. You mocked the warning, one elder told him gently, not because you were cruel but because you were certain. Certainty can be louder than respect. He learned that the Spirit was never meant to punish. Its role was to protect balance between people and the identities they carried. When someone used their name as a weapon, when they filled it with pride but emptied it of responsibility, the balance weakened. The warning he had heard was an invitation, a chance to pause, to listen, to step back. By laughing, he had refused the invitation. The elders explained that when balance is rejected, the Spirit does not destroy. It removes what is being misused. His name had become a tool of ego, not a reflection of truth. So it was taken, not out of anger but necessity. This understanding cut deeper than fear ever had. Because it meant the loss was not random. It was earned. He spent days listening. Reading forgotten texts written in careful, patient language. Learning rituals that were not performances, but acts of humility. He discovered that in many traditions, a name is not fully owned by a person. It is borrowed, from ancestors, from community, from purpose. To mock a warning was to mock that shared trust. And yet, the elders did not speak of hopelessness. They spoke of paths. Balance, they said, could be restored, but not demanded. Redemption was not about pleading for what was lost. It was about becoming someone who could carry it again. Or carry something new. This frightened him more than the loss itself. Because it meant change without guarantee. As he listened, memories stirred. Moments where he had spoken over others, dismissed concerns, laughed at discomfort he did not feel. He saw now how often he had confused confidence with truth. How easily he had mistaken attention for worth. The Spirit's warning had not been cruel. It had been kind. That realization weighed heavily on him. One night, alone in a quiet room lit by a single lamp, he acknowledged something he had avoided since the beginning. He did not miss his name because it made him important. He missed it because it connected him. To people. To memory. To meaning. And if that connection was ever to return, it would not come through clever words or public approval. It would come through action. Slow, unseen, and often uncomfortable. Before he left, one elder offered him a final thought. The Spirit does not ask if you want your name back, they said. It asks if you are willing to be remembered differently. That question stayed with him as he stepped back into the city. The streets looked the same, but he no longer felt lost within them. For the first time since the warning, direction replaced fear. The path ahead was unclear. But it existed. And somewhere along it, the possibility of redemption waited, not as a promise but as a test. The trial did not begin with ceremony. There were no chants, no gathering of witnesses, no dramatic sign to mark the moment. It began quietly in the way truth often does, when no one is watching and there is no audience to impress. The Spirit did not appear before him. Instead, it made itself known through expectation. The elders had warned him. This would not be a test of words. Apologies spoken aloud would carry no weight here. Promises made in desperation would fade as quickly as they were formed. What was required now was transformation, slow, uncomfortable, and unseen. The Spirit demanded not a plea but proof. His first task was simple in shape, yet heavy in meaning. He was told to serve where his presence would never be announced, to offer help where gratitude could not be returned, to give without attaching himself to the outcome. So he did. He cleaned spaces no one noticed. He carried burdens without explanation. He listened to stories without correcting or reframing them. When people spoke over him, he did not push back. When his efforts went unseen, he did not try to make them visible. At first, resentment flared. He was used to acknowledgement, used to being known. Each unnoticed effort felt like a small erasure all over again. But slowly something shifted. The work began to feel lighter. Not because it was easier, but because it no longer demanded performance. The Spirit watched. The second trial came through confrontation. He was led, not by force but by circumstance, to people he had once dismissed, elders he had laughed at, voices he had silenced with certainty. He was not asked to defend himself. He was not given space to explain his intentions. He was asked to listen, and listening hurt. He heard how his words had lingered long after he forgot them, how his laughter had cut deeper than anger would have, how his certainty had made others feel small, foolish, invisible. Each story struck like a quiet blow. Shame followed, heavy and sharp. He felt the urge to retreat, to explain, to soften the truth with context. But the trial allowed no escape. He stayed. He listened. He accepted the weight without pushing it away. The Spirit did not remove the pain. It allowed it to teach. The third trial was the hardest. He was asked to let go of the idea that his name should return at all. This demand unsettled him deeply. Without that hope, what was left? Why endure loss if restoration was not promised? He realized then how tightly he had still been holding on, to the belief that this journey would end with a reward shaped like the past. The Spirit required something else. Acceptance. He had to release the claim that identity was something owed to him. He had to accept that what was lost might remain lost, and that meaning could still exist without reversal. This broke him open. For the first time he grieved honestly. Not for status or recognition, but for the version of himself that had relied on noise to feel real. He mourned the certainty he once mistook for strength. He faced the truth that humility, once avoided, now shaped every step forward. As the days passed, subtle changes occurred. People did not remember him, but they remembered what he did. A clean space felt calmer. A shared burden felt lighter. A listened to story felt less lonely. He left no name behind, but he left impact. And impact, the elders said, was the first step toward being remembered. The Spirit drew closer then, not as a presence but as clarity. He understood that the cost of regaining a name would be heavier than losing it. To carry a name again meant carrying responsibility with it. Accountability. Restraint. The willingness to be smaller so others could stand taller. The trial was not about proving worth. It was about reshaping it. When the trial ended, there was no announcement. No sign that he had passed or failed. Only a quiet sense of completion, like a door closing gently behind him. He stood alone, unsure of what came next. But something inside him was steadier. The Spirit had not judged him harshly. It had judged him honestly. And honesty, he now understood, was the beginning of being remembered, not by the world but by the balance that held it together. The change did not arrive all at once. There was no moment where the air cracked open or the world shifted sharply back into place. Instead, the transformation came slowly, like dawn creeping across a quiet field, so gradual it could be missed if one wasn't paying attention. He noticed it first in others. People still could not recall his name. When they spoke to him, their voices carried the same uncertainty as before. But something else had changed. Their expressions softened. Their shoulders relaxed. They lingered longer in his presence. They remembered the feeling he left behind. A shopkeeper smiled when he entered, though they could not say why. A neighbor paused to thank him for something small he had done weeks earlier, surprised by their own gratitude. Children waved at him, not knowing his name but knowing his face as someone safe. He had become familiar without being labeled. One evening, as he walked the narrow crossing where everything had begun, the air thinned again. The city's noise faded. Shadows deepened along the stone walls. This time he did not laugh. He did not brace himself. He stood still. The Spirit did not appear as a figure. It appeared as understanding. The truth settled into him without words. His original name would not return. It had belonged to a version of himself shaped by pride and performance. That name had done its work, and had been released. Instead, something else was being formed. A new identity, quieter and lighter, was taking shape through action rather than announcement. It was not meant for stages or records. It was not meant to open doors. It existed in moments that did not ask to be remembered. The realization stung, but it did not feel cruel. He felt gratitude where anger might have lived before. The Spirit's judgment, he understood, had never been about punishment. It had been about correction. Balance restored not by giving back what was lost, but by offering something truer in its place. He no longer tried to explain himself. When people asked who he was, he answered simply. When confusion followed, he let it pass. The need to define himself had loosened its grip. He had learned that identity did not need to be spoken to exist. There were moments of sadness. Old achievements still echoed faintly, like songs from another life. Sometimes he missed the certainty that came with being known instantly. But the longing no longer ruled him. It rested alongside acceptance, not against it. In time he noticed something else. His own memory began to steady. Without the weight of his former name, his thoughts felt clearer. Memories arranged themselves by meaning rather than pride. He remembered kindnesses more sharply than praise. Failures became lessons instead of wounds. He had not regained his name, but he had gained presence. One evening, sitting alone, he spoke, not aloud but inwardly, to the space around him. There was no request in his thoughts, no bargaining, only acknowledgement. He understood now what the warning had truly meant. A name is not owned, it is carried. And when it grows heavier than the person holding it, balance will intervene. The Spirit did not answer. It did not need to. The world itself felt more aligned. Small moments made sense again. He belonged, not to reputation or memory but to the flow of things as they were. His new identity would never be written down. It would never be praised or repeated widely. But it would endure quietly, carried by those who felt its impact without knowing why. This was the name rewritten, not returned. And for the first time he did not feel diminished by that truth. He felt whole. Time moved forward as it always does. The city did not remember what it had lost. Streets filled. Voices rose and fell. New names took the places of old ones, spoken with confidence, written into records tied to ambition and noise. The world continued without pause. And so did he. Without a name to announce him, he learned to move gently through his days. He listened more than he spoke. He noticed things he had once rushed past. The way light softened on stone in the evening, the quiet relief in someone's breath when they were truly heard, the calm that settled when nothing needed to be proven. He lived smaller but deeper. Where he once chased recognition, he now chose presence. Where he once filled silence, he learned to sit within it. He understood that attention fades, but impact lingers in ways that cannot be measured. People did not tell stories about him, but they remembered moments. They remembered the stranger who helped without asking for thanks. The quiet figure who stayed when others turned away. The steady presence that made difficult days feel lighter, even if they could not explain why. His story became something else. Not a legend. Not a warning shouted aloud. A whisper. It passed gently from one person to another, never complete, never attached to a name. Elders spoke of it in fragments. Parents shared it when teaching humility. Children absorbed it without knowing they had learned anything at all. They spoke of a man who laughed at a warning and lost his name, but found himself. They spoke of balance. They spoke of respect. And they spoke carefully. He no longer feared forgetting. Because he understood now that identity does not live in sound or ink. It lives in choices made when no one is watching. In responsibility carried without reward. In humility that reshapes the self instead of defending it. A name can open doors, but it cannot hold a soul together on its own. That work belongs to the person beneath it. One evening, as the city settled into quiet, he stood where the narrow crossing met the old stone walls. The air felt ordinary. No thinning. No weight. Just the steady rhythm of life continuing. He smiled, not with pride but with peace. Somewhere beyond sight, balance rested. The Spirit no longer watched him closely. It did not need to. What mattered had already taken root. The warning had been spoken. The lesson had been learned. And what remained when the name was gone was something far more enduring than reputation. A self that could stand without being called.